Good morning. This is Jamaica Live on Bridge 99. I'm Bruce Golding. We're back here. We're here every Monday where we try to engage with people on particular topics that we think are important for us to discuss, for us to get a better understanding of. This past week we lost another trailblazer, another icon. A week before it was Bishop Desmond Tutu, who did so much, especially during the period when Nelson Mandela was still being held in prison. Did so much to sustain, to keep alive, to advance the struggle against apartheid, against white domination in South Africa. And then this past week we lost Sidney Poitier, another icon, a Caribbean man. He was actually born in the Bahamas, and he spent his last days in the Bahamas. He had maintained a home there. And he was the person who really broke through the white barrier of Hollywood. I mean, when I was growing up, you went to the movies. All the big roles in the movies were white people, and if they did have some black people, it was some minor role. Slaves and servants and so on. Sidney Poitier was the man who broke that down and demonstrated Lilies of the Field, where he won the Oscar for that role. And he was a human rights activist. He was somebody who did so much in the early days, in the days of Martin Luther King, to support the struggle for dignity and respect and equality for black people in America, and indeed right across the world. So today we honor him in the same way that we honored Bishop Desmond Tutu. We'll be with you until 2 o'clock. At a little after 1 o'clock, we're going to link with Harry Jam in New York so that we will embrace the Jamaican community there. Change, they say, is constant, is inevitable. Some changes happen quite suddenly, and you find yourself scrambling to deal with how it is going to affect you, or it has affected you. Like COVID. 2 years ago, most of us had never heard of COVID. And look at how it has messed up our lives since then. However, some changes occur very slowly. It creeps upon you without your noticing that it is happening. Until one day you realize that something has changed that affects you in terms of how you live. And because you didn't recognize that it was happening, you didn't prepare yourself for it. And you find yourself scrambling to deal with it as if it was an earthquake that just hit you. Today I want to talk about one of those changes, one of those creeping changes. And that is the aging of our population. We are living longer. More and more of us are growing older. In a sense, we have found a way to postpone death. Let me give you some numbers that will illustrate to you what I'm talking about. In the last 20 years, the population of Jamaica has increased by less than 5%. less than 5% in the last 20 years. But the number of persons living in Jamaica who are 75 years and older has increased by more than 20%. Life expectancy in Jamaica is increasing. I mean, when I was a boy growing up, life expectancy was in the 60s. Life expectancy in Jamaica today is somewhere around 75, 76. 70 plus brota. I mean, people can expect to live. I mean, some die earlier, of course, but and some live even longer than that. But the average life expectancy in Jamaica today is 75 or 76 years. What accounts for this? There are several things. Advancement in medical science and research has created medicines, surgical and therapeutic innovations that have helped us to overcome diseases and ailments that are normally associated with old age. People still get sick, you know, especially the older they get. But they're not dying as fast as they used to die. Medical science is enabling them to better manage their illnesses and to live longer lives. As I said, postponing death. But there are other reasons why all of this is happening. People have become more health conscious. And you see people on the road in the early morning, jogging and walking. I didn't see that when I was growing up. People have become more discriminate in terms of what they eat. Many of them try to avoid eating fatty foods. Many are cutting back on things like salt and sugar. Many avoid red meat. Some don't eat meat any at all. And then there's the reduction in the fertility rate. Women are having fewer children these days. We still have a fairly high incidence of teenage pregnancies. But what I have found, I mean, when I was in active politics and I used to look in my constituency, is that you still had teenagers who were getting pregnant. But after they had that first child, they either stopped or they cotched. It's not like in decades ago where, you know, by the time they're in the mid-20s, they're gone 3 and 4. They were having fewer children, perhaps having that first one just to establish their womanhood. And when you look at the numbers, 20 years ago, listen to these numbers again because it will further highlight what I'm talking about. 20 years ago, there were over 55,000 babies born in Jamaica. I'm talking about 2001. For that year, there were 55,000 babies born at Victoria Jubilee and at the various hospitals across the country, and some of them born at home with midwives. Today, that number has fallen to just over 30,000. I mean, that number has cut almost in half. And we see this reflected in our school enrollment numbers. 20 years ago, we had 335,000 children enrolled in our primary schools. Today, that number has fallen dramatically to about 210,000, from 335,000 to 210,000. Fewer children being born, fewer babies being born, so fewer children enrolling in primary school. So with fewer babies being born and older people living longer, the age structure of our population has changed significantly. Now, one may argue that all of this is a good thing. Women having fewer children means that they are less burdened with child care and are better able to take care of the children that they do have. More people being able to live to a ripe old age is a good thing, a blessing. It's wonderful to have grandpa and grandma spending more time with us before they go off to eternity. But it has serious implications for us as a society. And we have to prepare ourselves for that. It has serious consequences for families. And they have to prepare themselves for that as well. What are those implications? What are those consequences? Let me point you to some of them. With people living longer, the demands on the healthcare system has increased significantly. For because they are living longer, they need treatment and medication to enable them to continue living longer. You know, medicines work wonders, but the older you get, the more prone you are to illnesses of one kind or another. And therefore, the more you're going to be in need of healthcare facilities. So the pressure on our hospitals and clinics, the availability and the affordability of the medicines that they need have become a big issue. The ability of the government to respond to that, the ability of the government to expand our public health facilities, to increase the availability of doctors and nurses and medical technicians and support staff, all of that becomes critical. But there are other implications that I want to point out. The government provides social security protection through programs like the National Insurance Scheme and the PATH program. When people are living longer, it means that fewer people who are on these programs are dropping off because of death. So the number of persons on the programs keeps increasing. So the Social Security bill is getting higher and higher every year. Give you some numbers again. 20 years ago, the amount of money that was being paid out for NIS pensions was less than $2 billion a year. Today, that has increased to more than $20 billion. Now, during that period, of course, there have been some increases in the pension entitlement, increase in the amount of pensions that people receive. But much of that is due to the fact that more people are on the NIS pension. They get to 60 or 65, whatever is the eligible age, so they are entitled to the pension. And because fewer and fewer people are living longer, so fewer and fewer people are coming off the program, the number of persons who have to receive that check every fortnight continues to grow very rapidly. And this has raised serious questions on the National Insurance Scheme. Not new. It's something that I dealt with when I was in office. Because it raises questions about the sustainability of the National Insurance Scheme. Right now, the amount of money that is being paid out annually, each year, for NIS pensions is much more than the amount of contributions that are being collected from workers. And you will ask, well, how you make up the difference? Well, you make up the difference from investments. Because a lot of the money that they have collected in the past, they invested in various securities. So they earn money from investments, and that helps to make up the difference. But we are getting to a point where even that may not be enough. And therefore, the sustainability of the national insurance scheme is something that requires some serious discussion, serious consideration, because some changes will have to be made. But there are other implications of the aging of our population. The situation with the national insurance scheme is the same situation that applies to government pensions. Civil servants, teachers, policemen, doctors, nurses, when they reach 60, they're entitled to a pension which they have to get for the rest of their lives. Because so many of them are living longer, the pension bill has skyrocketed. Give you some numbers again. 20 years ago, it was about 5 billion. What the government had to budget every year to pay out all these pensions was 5 billion for the year. Today, that figure has increased to 40 billion, which puts a squeeze on the budget, because that 40 billion has to come out before they even consider how much money they're going to find now to spend on schools and hospitals and roads and fighting crime and so on. What makes matters worse is that only about 20% of the Jamaican workers, people in the workforce, only about 20%, 1 in 5, contribute to any pension scheme, whether some private pension scheme or to NIS. So the other 80% must depend either on investments that they made when they were working. They may have built or bought a house and they have that rented out, so they collect the rent. They may have invested in stocks, or they have to depend on what savings they had accumulated, which may be in the bank, and they're earning the interest on that. Many of them have to depend on the government through the PATH program to find a little money to put food on the table. But then the PATH program can only handle so many people. What happened to the rest? They have to depend on handouts from relatives and friends, and they're kind of batter around. You want me to take the break now? Continue. Yeah, okay. There are other implications of this, labor force implications. It has longer-term implications for the labor force. The availability of people of working age to support the needs of the economy. If fewer babies are being born, and especially with the low levels of skill training that we are experiencing, our economic growth may be stymied because we don't have sufficient people in the labor force to produce sufficient skilled persons in the labor force to support economic growth. That is the problem that Japan and some European countries are now experiencing. And then at the personal level, at the family level, the fact that more people are living longer raises serious issues for the families, for the household. The older they get, the more care and attention they need. They will have medical issues, they will have heart problems, diabetes, high blood pressure, maybe even cancer. And they will need special care. Some of them will have physical difficulties, chronic arthritis, blindness, muscular problems, Some of them may be unable to even make their own way to the bathroom. Some are bedridden. They need special care. Then there are mental issues, because the older you get, the more likely you are to suffer from mental illness, dementia, Alzheimer's. And when you get to that stage, you can be a danger not only to yourself, but to others if you're not closely monitored and supervised. How does the family cope with this? A few are able to place their elderly family members in a nursing home where they can receive professional care. Some are able to employ caregivers round the clock. But how many families can afford to do that? And how many can afford to be home to provide that care? They have to go to work. They have to try to earn a living. They may have children to look after. What they are earning may hardly be able to take care of that, much less to pay for the medication and provide the care, support that their elderly family members need. It is a serious national problem that we have largely overlooked, but it has crept upon us, and it is now staring us in the face. It requires urgent attention, national attention in terms of government policies and programs, but it also requires personal attention in terms of how we organize our homes and our families and our personal lives. That is going to be our discussion today when we come back. Welcome back. It's Jamaica Live. We're on Bridge 99. Today we're talking about the changing age structure of our population, the aging of our population, the fact that more and more people are living longer. And we want to explore what this means and what our response should be. And I'm pleased to welcome to the program two valuable guests. Mr. Don Anderson, who is head of Market Research Services and who is a renowned expert in public opinion surveys. And we also welcome Dr. Joan Payne, a graduate of Howard University, a member of the American Speech Language Association, but who has been recognized for her work and her expertise on the subject of aging and caregiving. Mr. Don Anderson, Dr. Joan Payne, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much.
Don, do we have you there? Sir Anderson's not on yet. All right, so we're trying to link with him. Dr. Payne.
Yes.
How important is this issue of the aging of our population, and what are the implications?
Well, the fact that we're getting older in most countries, in the United States certainly, the population of people who are 65 and older is growing exponentially. In fact, the population of older adults is growing faster than the population of children and babies. We just seem to be a nation of older people. And with that, we have really great implications for service delivery and for the kind of programming that we need to have in this country to meet the needs of folks who are getting older. For example, you mentioned caregiving, and yes, I've written a book on caregiving and done a forum here in Washington on caregiving. One of people getting older is that we have to have services available and people to care for people who are older whose health is compromised by aging. So that's one of the things that we have to focus on. People need to be trained and available to help take care of our older citizens because they certainly deserve to age with respect and with dignity. So that's one thing. Of course, we're seeing in this pandemic how fragile our health systems are. And so I think what we're going to see is more and more training of health professionals and more services in health because we're also seeing health disparities. In that, it's so expensive now to get sick, to buy medications, to go to the hospital. So I think we're going to see a range of services increasing so that people can age with dignity and can have their needs met, not only for care but for health care services.
I believe we have Don Anderson online now. Don, are you there?
Yes, Bruce. How are you doing,
I'm going to come to you in a moment, but let me just follow through with Dr. Payne. Dr. Payne, what implications does this have for government financial ability to respond, one, and two, the individual affordability? I mean, our families, I mean, we're talking about a global problem, but I'm here in Jamaica. In Jamaica, a lot of families can barely put food on the table, let alone to take care of the special needs of some elderly family member. How are they going to cope?
It's a problem for everybody. For the most part, people who are caring for people who are older are themselves caring for families. They have children who are of an age that they need to pay attention to them, and they're expensive, and they have husbands or wives, and of course they're getting older and they're presenting with health care issues. So it's a problem for everybody. In Washington, D.C., for example, there is a Department on Aging, and with one of the mayors here in Washington, Marion Barry, there was a focus given, which we're still enjoying, focus given to providing services through the district government so that people can have access to health care workers and have access to medical care at a reasonable cost to the families. We had a hospital here.
But that is supported by government.
Yes, the government itself provides really great services for families and for people who are getting older. So I don't know the mechanics of how this all is being paid for, but I know that many of these services are free of charge to citizens. So I think we're talking about leadership in the country prioritizing what we should do for people who are older and who may be compromised health-wise and financially, so that we can provide a good quality of care. You know, the value of a country is in how the country can take care of its children and take care of its adults, its elders. And so we've got to be mindful that we have to do both.
Part of our problem, of course, is that I don't know that we had anticipated it to the extent that we should have and made the preparation. Don, you have been in the field several times and for different purposes. But what is your sense in terms of the aging structure of our population, and what are the implications that it has for us?
Thank you very much, Bruce, for inviting me. And hi, Dr. Payne. Listen attentively to yourself and Dr. Payne just now, Bruce. And I think you've all summed it up so very clearly, because I don't know much of the data was shared with your listeners across the diaspora, but it is in fact a very serious problem, that we probably haven't even taken a good look at. The under 15 population, let's use one cohort, has been declining significantly from 1960. It is now representing 21% of the total population, down from 41% in 1960. That's a significant decline, And of course, there's a concomitant increase in the persons 15 to 60, and as Dr. Payne just said, significantly so amongst persons in the over 60 category. That is increasing at a very rapid rate. And therefore, what this does is to put a significant amount of pressure on the resources, public or private, and as a matter of fact, public and private, to be able to deal with this phenomenon. It's part of a world trend. When you look at other countries, the pattern is not significantly different. There's a increasing number of persons growing older, and especially amongst women. Women are actually, have a greater lifespan now than males in Jamaica. And therefore, it is a major problem that has to be addressed because, and both yourself, Dr. Payne, and Bruce made reference to the need for social intervention of a broad spectrum to be able to deal with this challenge.
Don,
And
Don,
dare say that
I recall looking at the last survey of living conditions. I think it was 2018, and one of the things that they captured in there was the plight. My word, not theirs.
right.
The plight of the elderly population, because many of them found themselves in circumstances where their family members, not because of any hardness of heart, just couldn't care for them properly, and they were basically just left. Some of them bedridden, and they got something to eat, but whether or not what they were getting to eat was nutritionally appropriate for them, basically they were just being left there to die.
So the problem has been exacerbated by COVID, of course.
Yes.
Because the health sector, I mean, we all know, has been severely challenged in terms of meeting all the immediate demands. And the data that one has been looking at is pre-COVID, the challenges in terms of the problems that the older generation is facing. Healthcare, is a key factor. So now you run, in a way, into a roadblock with the problems that are being generated specifically by COVID. And that really has made the situation that much worse,
What long-term implications does this have for us? Looking down the road in terms of, one of the issues, for example, that I think we need to look at is whether or not our demographics will provide the population to support our economic growth objectives. If you have a smaller percentage of your population in that working age cohort, and a smaller, and only a fraction of those having the skills that the economy needs if it is to go forward. This has serious implications for us in terms of long-term planning, no?
If I might, it does indeed. And, of course, what we may be looking at here is the need to share resources across demographic boundaries, across countries. Everybody's been stretched terribly because of COVID. And we're seeing, for example, that people are also leaving the healthcare professions because they're just burned out and exhausted. And the facts are that the pandemic has exposed some of the needs in the healthcare system that have not been met. So in order for all of us to thrive, whether we're in the United States or whether we're in Jamaica, we need to be open to sharing our resources, whatever they are, not only vaccines, but also personnel, and also making sure that we have paid attention across the spectrum, diaspora in particular, to meeting the needs of people, because we can't afford to lose anybody. We really can't. Everybody's valuable within a society, regardless of age. And so I hope that we'll be able to work it out. I don't know the mechanism that we have to do this, but it seems to me that if one country has more, then that we should be willing to share.
Well, COVID has exposed, in my view, the kind of false nationalism, better word for it is selfishness, of countries.
Yes.
In the early stages of the vaccine rollout, there was one country that had stockpiled enough vaccines to give each of their citizens 5 doses. And countries like Jamaica, not to mention countries in Africa, couldn't get hold of the first dose.
That's right. Well, that's we can't afford this. And so what we have to do, I think, is to continue to put pressure on our national and international leadership, because nobody wins if we are losing big segments of our society. We're losing our history. We're losing our culture. We're losing a great deal of the elder population has so much to offer in terms of talent, too, that's not being tapped. And certainly this is a very vulnerable population with respect to the COVID pandemic. But I think that we need to come together as within the diaspora and make sure that we are not only sharing our resources, but that we are absolutely meeting the needs of our senior citizens.
Don, to what extent has migration been a factor here, both outward and inward? The majority of the people who migrate from Jamaica would be young people. And I imagine that a lot of Jamaicans who migrated in the past, when they reach retirement age, that's when they choose to return to Jamaica because they can no longer put up with the cold. So to what extent has that impacted the kind of numbers we're looking at?
It obviously would have some impact, Bruce, but I don't think that the migration factor is a major one. And one of the things I'm pointing to substantiate that is that when you look at the growth in the population over the last, 20 years, for example, that average annual growth rate is less than 1%.
Less than 1%, that's right.
Right, you see? So what is happening?
There's a time when it was more than 2.
Exactly.
And that's when I remember the family planning program was introduced, and we coined the slogan, 2 is better than too many.
Exactly, right? So now we have a annual growth rate of 0.44%. Now, that means that there's not enough new people coming into the population to be able to make that kind of difference. So migration may cancel out somewhere along the line because people are leaving, people are coming back, especially the older persons, which again is probably something that is impacting the number of older people within the population.
Are we likely to get to the point anytime soon, Don, where our population in fact starts to decline?
Well, I do have some data you see that I want to share, right? What you find is that the growing disparity in the under 15 population is declining. In other words, there is some kind of narrowing of the difference between the over 15 and the under 15 population. So that is probably nothing more than a little ray on the horizon, because that's in the distant future, not immediate. So I think I want to go back to a point that was made earlier to talk about the balancing of the use of the resources, because we're going to have to deal with a growing older population for some time to come. And therefore, one has to make really serious health provisions, especially against the background of COVID, to mitigate against that. And at the same time, no great economy can be built on older persons. It has to be the younger persons, and therefore we have to find a way. And like Dr. Payne, I don't have the answers now, but a way would have to be found to incorporate these people into the economy, into the growing economy, so that in fact, they can mitigate against the problems that are going to be experienced amongst the older population, the fact that it is still growing and increasing at a rate which is not comfortable for any country, especially Jamaica with its limited resources, and now the problem with COVID.
But that raises some other issues, though. I mean, I was reading an article over the weekend where the point was made, and I don't know how much research was behind it, but the point was made that to the extent that people are living longer and people are staying in the labor force, in the active labor force for longer periods of time, many countries are finding that their labor force is less responsive to innovation, to the introduction of technology, because the older people in the labor force are just not embracing the kind of change that is required.
Definite limitation. But by the same token, you're going to need, where are the resources supposed to come from? It's either public sector or private sector. Public sector has an obligation, basically, in terms of the healthcare facilities for the elderly. But I believe that there is a big role for private sector in terms of developing modern technologies to be able to deal with that situation amongst the older generation, but also to encourage a greater degree of digitization and modernization of the technology that is being used to help us in our quest for a better economic perspective. So I see it's a two-pronged approach, and I believe that the private sector certainly has a major role to play. Let's look at the healthcare facilities and construction that is taking place today, for example. I don't know how many construction projects right now are factoring for older persons. But the technology has to be introduced so that, again, here's one aspect that, could certainly deal with the challenges that older persons are going to face. But the economy is definitely going to be burdened by the fact that the workforce is getting older and older. And it is getting older and older because there are insufficient young persons coming into the population to make a tangible difference in a short time.
Dr. Payne, you mentioned the initiative that was introduced in Washington by Mayor Marion Barry.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me, do you know of any particular country that has confronted this problem and has provided some kind of model that we could look at?
No, I don't, but I think that's a very good question. I know that apparently the Scandinavian countries, if we're talking about other places, have been in the forefront of providing innovative care for its citizens. Even during the pandemic, when the United States was scuffling about giving its citizens some incentive funds to keep going.
Of course, they do that by... They're able to do that by imposing what I'm told is an average 45% personal tax on their citizens.
Yes. And folks are mad as they could be about it, but folks needed it because there was food anxiety. People didn't have anything to eat. They had no jobs. And so this was a way of rising to the occasion. Not that well, but at least it was an attempt to do it. I would say that there are probably some other examples, perhaps in South America, perhaps in England, perhaps where they have nationalized medicine.
Chile was mentioned to me, but I haven't been able to study the situation there.
What is that? Which country? I didn't hear the name of the country.
Chile,
yes. Yes. You might also want to look at, there are people who think very well of Brazil, and at least before this last president, and Argentina also, and Peru. Maybe countries that I might want to study. I'm afraid I can't answer the question directly, but I'm sure you're right in saying that there are those places, and maybe New Zealand might be another example. There are those countries where there have been wonderful experiments in increasing services to senior citizens and to the more vulnerable in our populations, and they have been very successful.
Don,
and I think
go ahead. I'm sorry, Dr. Payne, go ahead.
Oh, I was wrapping up. I think that's a worthwhile topic to study.
Yes. Don, the last population census we did was 2011, I believe.
That's correct. Mm-hmm.
And we would be due back in the field now because it's supposed to be done on a 10-year cycle, but I imagine COVID is perhaps going to delay that. It would be interesting to see what those numbers produce in terms of the trends we have seen. You don't expect any difference. I mean, you expect the trends to continue, no?
I certainly do, and there is a projection for 2021. I'm relying upon data from Statin and PSPIOJ, and there is a projection of the population at 2.96 million. All right, which again just feeds into the annual growth rate of 0.44%.
You have a breakout of that in terms of the age cohorts?
Say that again.
Do you have a breakout of that projection in terms of the age cohorts?
Up to 2018 for sure, yes.
Mm.
All right, and it's not as discrete as I'd like, not as granular as I'd like, but the under 15 population in 2018 accounted for 21% of the total population, as against 70% in the 15 to 64 age group. And in the 65 plus age group.
And you had given us a comparison earlier. In 1960, what was that comparison?
Right. I just want to share that with you now. Let me run down 1960, 1980, 2011, when we last did, and the projection to 2018. The under 15 population in 1960 was 41%, 32% in 1980, 26% in 2011, and 21% in 2018. So you can see the decreasing relevance, numerical relevance, so to speak, of the under 15 population. When you look at the 15 to 64 over those same 4 periods, 55% of the 15 to 64, or in 1960, the 15 to 64 population accounted for 55%, 60% in 1980, 66% in 2011, and 70% projected in 2020. What about the 65 plus? 4% in 1960, 8% in 1980, 8% in 2011, and projected to be 9% in 2020. So we can see the decline in relevance, numerically so, of the under 15, and an increasing relevance of the over 15, and in particular of the 65 plus population. And there are some data collected maybe some years ago that show that the over 60 population is increasing significantly, right? From 2005, I think it was 10%. It's now projected to be 15%. So you can see the challenges that are going to be faced. We have never been overly focused on provision for the elderly. And now with COVID, we have to really be creative and direct in terms of how we can program to alleviate the challenges. And you articulated them so very beautifully about the challenges that people are going to face as they grow older. You know, displacement, medical problems, mental problems, all kinds of challenges. Are we focused to deal with that at the moment? No. But we should actually be talking more about public sector, private sector initiatives to mitigate those kinds of problems, because it's going to be I don't want to use the word catastrophe, but it's going to be pretty serious if we
I mentioned earlier, Don, just to bear out the figures that you just cited. I mentioned earlier that primary school enrollment in 2001 was 335,000. And currently, even before COVID, it had fallen to a little over 200,000. Now, we really ought, we shouldn't have to build any primary schools for a long time.
No.
And classroom sizes should have now arrived at the optimal figure.
Absolutely.
But then it has serious implications for us at the other end.
It certainly does.
In terms of national policy, what advice would both of you give? I mean, if the cabinet was in the room sitting and listening, what is the approach that needs to be taken at this stage?
If I might speak frankly, I would say that certainly prioritizing health care and services to older adults ought to be looked at very seriously.
Well, Dr. Payne, you live in a rich country, you know. When my poor Minister of Finance has to make some decisions between paying our civil servants a little more because they deserve it, or providing money to fight the monster of crime, or fixing some of the terrible roads over which we have to traverse. And you say to him, well, you know, you need to carve out some money to deal with providing better care for the elderly. There are some hard choices that have to be made, no?
Yes, there are some hard choices, but this is to provide good health care for the citizens ought to be a priority anyway. And I understand what you're saying, that there are other needs that are equally important too. But if people are not healthy, and if they're not thriving, you know, your workforce is really going to be impacted. And you know, you've got a whole area of working people who can be trained to be effective caregivers, for example, or who could be trained to be effective healthcare providers.
But they have to be paid.
They have to be paid, but yes, but they also will pay taxes when they're working. So I don't know what your unemployment rate is, but that's a whole job area that could benefit the country and benefit the citizens too. There are programs, I do know that AARP, for example, the American Association of Retired Persons, has a website. And I do know that there's training going on in this country, and I'm not sure what the money is. I don't know that. But there's training going on to get people ready to deal with not only the health disparities in this country, which are very real, but also preparing people to take care of the senior citizens, even within families, because families can be an excellent source of care for folks, and they can make money doing it. if the government sees fit to provide a small stipend to caregivers to be able to take care of their elderly. So there are a lot of things we can look at.
Don, are you there?
Yeah, man, with you.
Yeah, the government has enunciated a national policy on aging, which I read. And it's a framework document, no? It cites what one may call best practices, but how you translate that now into resource allocation is another matter. And I don't know whether or not some creative mechanisms could be found, whether tax incentives, credits, whatever it is, to do what Dr. Payne is talking about, which is to basically employ or to facilitate the employment of persons to provide the kind of care that the aging population is going to need.
In principle, this is one of the answers. I haven't read that paper yet, Bruce, but I kind of believe I understand what the thrust would be. The challenge, of course, is that at the moment, made much worse by COVID, there aren't going to be sufficient public resources to be able to deploy, what is necessary to make a big difference in the short space of time. And we do need interaction and intervention in the short space of time. So I think whilst that is on the table and whatever the government can do in this regard should be done as a matter of urgency, I think we also have to look to the private sector. And what are we talking about? First of all, we have to accept, and I think we all agree, that there's need for greater social intervention for older persons. Now, this could be in terms of encouraging them to invest in more pension schemes and make the money available. Obviously, everybody's challenged under the circumstances, all right? But also, I think we need to try to encourage the private sector, and the private sector needs to be alerted to the importance of dealing with this situation and helping the private sector to invest in institutional care for the elderly. I think the government is not going to be able to really handle this in a significant way in the short run. So we're talking about an overall thrust to improve health care for the elderly, training of persons in public health, dealing with the aging, geriatrics, etc., and the use of age-friendly technologies. And I mentioned construction earlier. This is an important factor. We're building a lot of residential high-rise buildings in this country now. How many of them are considering the importance of elderly people?
In terms of access, you mean?
We're talking, sorry?
In terms of access?
Yes, you see? So I think it's a public-private sector partnership, and here is where this has to materialize, because there's no way that I believe the public sector, given the kind of resource constraint at the moment, that it will be able to deal efficiently with making provision for the elderly, given the trend that we're seeing, and given all the kinds of growing health factors that are going to actually manifest themselves even more post-COVID. Hope that's near, but we don't know about that.
We have exhausted all the time that we have. I want to thank both of you, Don Anderson, our own Don Anderson from Market Research Services, and Dr. Joan Payne from Washington, D.C. Thank you both so much for joining me and for helping us with this very important topic and helping us to understand it better. Thank you so much.
You're so welcome. Take care.
Welcome back. It's Jamaica Live. We're on Bridge 99. We're going to be linking with Irie Jam in New York in a short while. So at that time, we're going to be hailing up Beauregard and his crew. We've been talking about the aging of our population and what it means. We had a very useful discussion with Mr. Don Anderson and Dr. Joan Payne on the issue. And we're now going to be joined by Mr. Paul Bourne, who is the head of institutional research at the Northern Caribbean University. I hope we have him on the line.
Yes, how you do?
Hi, how are you, Mr. Bourne? Welcome. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you. It's an honor being on the program, sir.
Now, you have done some amount of research on this topic, and you have written about it. What are your findings, and can you share your own perspective with us. Is this a problem that we are taking seriously enough? What are the implications, and what is it demanding of us in terms of our response?
Very, very good question, sir. The matter is a dire one, but are we taking it seriously? And the answer is no. I had an article that I wrote some time ago, 2018 to be specific, on population aging, emphasis in Jamaica. Then I began looking at this population, this aging phenomenon. And we want our listeners to understand exactly what we mean by aging, all right? There are two definitions. United Nations say aging is a chronological age from 65 and beyond, whereas the World Health Organization...
What is the magic of 65?
I presume it is relation to the retirement age taken from the United Nations approach.
Because I know of many people 70 years old in their early 70s, and they don't look particularly old to me. I wonder whether we shouldn't revisit that kind of classification.
But that was something that was done some time ago in terms of looking at when people retire.
Yes.
So they were looking at retirement age to determine dependency ratio, the economic dependency ratio, and the age dependency ratio. So that was in that context. So what we can say, what we should do now is to begin to look at where we are in terms of given that most persons I know, the life expectancy is beyond 70 years old.
Yes.
And in Jamaica, 72 for men and 77 for women. We just start looking at that to say, is this a good age for people to retire?
Yes.
But that's for another discussion.
But the significant thing is that wherever you cut it, I cited some numbers before, for example, that show that the number of persons 75 years and over in the last 20 years has increased by 20%, whereas the population itself has increased by less than 5%.
And that is a critical thing that we need to be addressing, because what we are not looking at, can we continue to sustain the aging population? And maybe, and I'm going to put it this way, maybe COVID-19 is a blessing to address the issue that we don't want to address. Because a number of persons who are dying from COVID are in the older ages. So maybe COVID is trying to balance all things to give us some time to actually put our house in order.
What a morbid way to put it.
So I'm putting that in terms of some context. But what we are not looking at when an individual ages, what does it mean? Apart from the fact that some diseases come with aging, the degeneration of the human cells, we're not thinking that they must be maintained in terms of, one, whether they're going to go to private hospital, two, how they're going to actually be treated by the society. All of those things are going to be cost. And if it is that our working age population from those of 15 to our current 64 years old, or 60 in some cases, are not increasing because of what is happening to the population structure in Jamaica and the world that is, then what is going to happen to us is that a number of these individuals will be left there in the cold because we won't be able to afford it.
Well, we're talking about a segment of the population whose dependency quotient is pretty high, no?
Very, very high. Sir.
Now, in terms of the surveys you have done, how are they faring? Are they looking after themselves, or they're being looked after by relatives and so on? How are they making out?
We did a study recently that looks at the aging of individuals over 65 years old. And 70% of them indicate that as a result of COVID, they are worse off as a result of COVID. And one of the fundamental findings that emerged...
Did you do any studies before COVID?
But during COVID, this one happened because we want to see what is going on with COVID.
No, I understand that, but then COVID is fairly new. Do you have any data as to what was their situation prior to COVID?
Yes, ma'am. We have a number of things, and Professor Elmer has written on those things as well, and that's extensively discussed in terms of the social issues, the challenges that they are facing, the issue relating to their health conditions. All of that is also well documented.
As you mentioned, Professor Denise Elmer Shearer, I mean, I don't know how I ended up doing discussing a subject like this without her, because she is our expert on
She
this,
is the expert
on this
on
matter, but unfortunately she happened to have been traveling, I think, off the island, so she wasn't available today.
Okay. So what we're saying is that we are not taking into consideration the real cost of age in Jamaica. We're skirting around the issue because we are thinking, okay, then persons are age, and people are thinking that many of them will actually go to retirement homes, whether private or public. But they are not thinking that these individuals are going to be a burden on society if they are not working and taken care of by family, if they are not working.
Well, this is why, Mr. Bourne, I want to zero in, I want to drill down on this. In this surveys that you did, and I want to kind of take COVID out of it for the time being. The surveys that you did, what did you find to be their circumstance? For example, are they being able to have 3 good meals a day? Are they able to get the medication that they need because of the particular conditions that they may be experiencing? How many of them were able to benefit from some government program with a path? Did you get that kind of detail?
Yes, we have. In fact, we found that prior to COVID, we're speaking of before COVID, that 2/3 of our elderly that we sampled indicated that they were having economic challenges with dealing with their retirement, dealing with the situation, and that social isolation was a critical issue that they were actually facing, which means that a number of our elderly are home, and home technically alone. All right? So they're having the difficulty of having to deal with the challenges relating to being an individual who is aged with illnesses or without illnesses, and having to deal with this economic situation of the high cost of living within their constrained income.
What impact was government social welfare benefits having on them? What impact, for example?
Many of them were accessing that. And we did a research where we made a recommendation that maybe what should be happening, we should have individuals who are like wardens assigned to elderly to address some of their issues relating to giving them medication, ensuring that they are benefiting from the social network programs that are instituted by the government. Because a number of them, although they haven't heard of it, are not benefiting from these things because they have not signed up, etc., etc.
What about church organizations in terms of their relief programs? Is that having any impact?
The church is really making an impact on the general landscape of the elderly. But what we need to understand is that the church is only able to offer thus much because of the resources that they have. And we have also made recommendations to the other churches that what they should do within our current time here now is that they need to expand and intensify their program relating to assisting the elderly, because a number of them are there alone that need help. So we need to begin to look at this elderly phenomenon far more than we currently are. All we are seeing is that, yes, they are aging, yes, they are elderly, but we are not thinking about the cost and all the life that comes with aging and how they are going to age and live healthily during their aging and their age and their time before death.
So are you suggesting that there are some preparations that these persons ought to have made for themselves, which they may not be able to do at this stage? But is there any recommendation, for example, coming out of your studies that suggests to people that, look, you're going to get old one day, you're going to probably suffer from maladies of one kind or another. Take this thing seriously and begin to make preparations. Put down something somewhere, small though it may be, to at least help you to manage those evenings of your life. Are there any recommendations that came out of your studies?
Yes, we have made a number of recommendations, and that's what I said to you. One of the things that we also encourage the church is that they need to begin a educational campaign as to making their members aware that aging is an issue that a number of them are going to be dealing with, and that they need not only say that they're getting old and that they will have invested in their children, but to safeguard themselves against the challenges of your children dying or being unable to assist you during your age period. So what we have been encouraging, and more so from the perspective of individuals who can reach these individuals, is that they need to educate them on retirement planning, and taking care of yourself during or before you actually reach that aging phase of your life.
What did your studies find is the level of responsibility, faithfulness of children in supporting their elderly parents? And to what extent are they kind of, just turning their back and living their own lives? What did you find?
That's an excellent question, and I really don't want to release the information, but given that you have put me on the spot, we have found out that just about 30% of the elderly indicate that they are getting assistance from their children.
30%?
About 30%.
And what about the other 70%?
Well, that is a challenge that I didn't actually want to release that information.
Why not? Because it's important that we understand it.
Yes, but it means that a number of our elderly are technically on their own. They are fending for themselves. Now, is it economic time that is actually creating that for the elderly? Or is it that the children have changed in terms of their perspective on their responsibility in terms of their parents?
But these numbers are important because there may be another factor.
Yeah.
And I mean, if you're dealing with children who themselves are unemployed, have no resources, they hustle every day to try and see if they can find enough food to keep them going for the day. It may not be bad-mindedness on their part. It may be just that they're not in a position to provide their parents with the kind of support that children would normally provide. Did you get any numbers on that?
No, we did not. We haven't gotten that. But what we do see in terms of using the figures, I'm sure you're aware of that, in terms of the unemployment rates in Jamaica, then a number of our children, as you rightfully mentioned, are unemployed. So if that intensifies and the challenges become greater for the children, then what they're going to have to be doing is trying to think of how they need to survive. And how they need to survive will exclude most of the times mommy and daddy. So that is why we are encouraging the church and other organizations to come in and assist at this time, and we're arguing and forwarding the idea that we should not see that children are neglecting their parents, but each person who can assist must come in now and assist the elderly because they are there, and the reality is such that they need assistance.
Did you get a sense as to the response of the community? I mean, when I was growing up, for example, in a rural community up in St. Faith's in St. Catherine, if there were old people in the community, it's almost like the community took it on as their responsibility. So, they would prepare meals and take. Is there much of that kind of empathy at the community level these days in relation to the elderly?
There is. In fact, looking at what is happening in Manchester, Mandeville's environs, I've been in dialogue with individuals, and we're also thinking of even providing and it's a thought that we had. We're providing a hospital service that where ambulance could actually go out and actually take a number of individuals who are sick and deal with buying groceries, etc. So there is things going on across Jamaica, but I'm speaking of Mandeville.
But not enough to cover.
And that is a challenge that we're having. And that's why we're arguing that other persons need to come on board in terms of trying to assist these individuals at the moment. Because a number of elders are on their own, living on their own. And some of them suffer from dementia and other illnesses.
Yes.
And they're all on their own with many of their children overseas.
Yes. Can I ask you, Mr. Bourne, just hold, let me just take a break and we'll come right back to you.
Okay, sir.
Welcome back. It's Jamaica Live. We're on Bridge 99. And we're linking now. We have linked with Ira Jam in New York. So let me hail up Beauregard. Are you there?
Good afternoon, sir. How you doing?
How are you doing, my friend?
I'm all right. Everything good.
I see the weather has turned ugly on you.
Well, today we are about at the mid-30s, and the temperature should fall tonight extremely. So, the conditions will be different tomorrow.
Well, I'm not buying no ticket to come up here.
It's a sad time now with this weather for a lot of people. Unfortunately, there was a tragedy in the Fordham Heights section of the
Yes, I
Bronx
noticed
yesterday.
that. You're talking about the fire?
Yes, the fire. And
No.
today the mayor had to drop the numbers to the amount of people they said died yesterday. It was 19. Now the number was dropped to 17. It's 8 children and 9 adults.
Any
that were killed in the
Jamaicans,
fire.
do you know?
I'm not sure, but I know mostly West African and Gambian people live in that
Oh,
section
Lord.
of
A
the
terrible
Bronx that
thing.
were affected. True indeed. And also COVID cases, that continues to rise over on this side. So that's a big concern going forward for a lot of people still.
Yeah.
And also, if you have time, I would just like to, ask you about this question. It's becoming very worrisome for a lot of people, a lot of Jamaicans and friends of Jamaica, here in the diaspora and all over the world, with the stalemate that we see happening with the current government of Jamaica and the Chief Richard Curry of the Maroons. Is there any light that you can shed on what's happening? Give us any clarity and any suggestions
I can
that
only
you
give
might
you,
have?
I can only give my own personal perspective on it.
Mm-hmm.
It's an issue that we have kind of ignored for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
The Maroons seem to rely on the treaty that was entered into with Britain
Mm-hmm.
years ago. I mean, long before slavery was abolished, before we became independent. Now, in the past, the Maroon leaders have made reference to it,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't think that they have sought to assert it as a kind of sovereign declaration. We now have a young Colonel Curry, who thinks differently. And he seems to be of the view that this is something that gives the Maroons autonomy, sovereignty. They have the right to set their own laws and to administer without any reference to the constitutional arrangements of Jamaica. And what the Prime Minister sought to do yesterday, in as assertive a language as Mr. Curry used, is to say, no, that's not on. The Maroons are part of Jamaica. And bear in mind, we're talking about a compound now because that's where Colonel Curry is.
Yes.
But then you have other Maroon communities. You have in Scotts Hall. You have in Maroon Town in Portland. So the big question is then, if you're talking about sovereignty, what you mean? Do you mean that Maroon Town in Portland is a sovereign country? And do you mean that Scotts Hall in St. Mary is a sovereign country? And then when you get to Akampong, that's another sovereign country. Who's going to, how are they going to be governed? I mean, there is a lot of issues, no? So maybe we have been negligent because we have never put the matter to a serious discussion and sought to deal with it with clarity. Maybe the time has come for us to do that now. But there's no issue of instability, It is more well, in America, for example, you have American Indians, no? Native Indians.
Yes.
And they live in their own kind of commune.
Yes.
And they're allowed certain latitude in terms of the governance structure, which is what the Maroons enjoy here. But I don't believe that any of those people living on Indian reservations would ever believe at any stage that they're a sovereign entity and that they can look to the federal government and say, don't put your foot across my border because we run things over here. I don't think that happens in America, and I don't think it's going to happen here in Jamaica either.
Are there what would you say is a swift solution for both sides?
There perhaps needs to be some dialogue, but the dialogue has to be conducted with firmness. And bluntly, I think that the Maroons have to be told that, look, We respect your cultural heritage. We respect your right to observe your cultural traditions, but understand that you are part of Jamaica, governed by the Constitution of Jamaica, subject to the laws that's passed in Gordon House, the Houses of Parliament. And when election time comes, you are entitled to go there and vote out the government if you're not happy with what the government is doing. But this business about you being a sovereign state, forget it. I think they have to be told that very firmly.
Okay. Thank you very much, sir.
Yeah, okay. All right, all the best to you. Beauregard.
Thank you.
Today we've been talking about aging, the aging structure of our population. We had online before we took the break Mr. Paul Bourne from NCU, who has done some research on this. Just want to wrap up with you, Mr. Bourne. The findings of your study, have that been made available to the government in terms of helping them to define their policy approach and response?
Well, I'm not sure how to answer that question, but what I've been doing, I've been making things available online in terms of having them published. So most of the studies that I have done that we speak of now are there online, but I've not made them specifically to the government or policymakers. Have you
been in any dialogue with Dr. Elimar Shearer in terms of the work that you're doing?
No, sir, but I did some work with her as well when I was in her department.
Well, we need to wire it up, we need to link it up, because it's important that we get all of these resources, coming together to help us to address the problem.
Absolutely.
But I want to thank you for the work that you're doing, and I want to thank you for joining me on the program today. Thank you very, very much.
It's my esteemed pleasure.
Good. Thank you so much. We're now going to be joined by Mr. Dennis Chung, who is an economic analyst of some repute and commands considerable respect in terms of his understanding of these issues. Dennis, do we have you on the line?
I did.
Are you there?
Hello. Yes, I'm here. I'm hearing you.
Yeah, Dennis. We're talking about the changing age structure of the population, which is something that we perhaps have not focused as much attention on as we should. I quoted some figures at the start of the program to show that in the last 20 years alone, and we could go back even beyond that, but in the last 20 years alone, when the population has grown by less than 5%, the persons over 75 years of age has increased by over 20%. And I wanted to see if you can help us to understand. Don Anderson pointed out to us, for example, earlier in the program, that if you look at 1960, more than 50% of the population was made up of children under 15. That number, he says, is now down to something like 15%. So we're having fewer children, which in a sense is a good thing. People are living longer because they have access to medicines that were not available before, which is a good thing. But this has serious implications for policymakers. It has serious implications for long-term planning. It has serious implications for our labor market. What are those implications, Dennis, and what should we be doing about it?
Well, Mr. Golding, I think it's a great topic that you're looking at. And from us at PSOG, I've been pointing out this issue as something that has been coming. And I say that against the background, you will recall more than maybe anybody else of certain things. Number one is that we already have been showing high unemployment amongst the young persons, right? And that means that there's a lower capacity to support the aging population from a private point of view. But even more concerning is the fact that we have, in the government in particular, a very large pension liability that is not shown on the fiscal accounts because it deals mostly with cash accounting. But if you look at the pension liability, and you recall the argument at the time that was made when the IMF was here, even before 2013, about this issue of the pension liability. We're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars at least, right? Now, how are we going to afford that, particularly with...
Well, Dennis, if I could interrupt you. I mean, I quoted some figures earlier. 20 years ago, the public pension bill, not talking about NIS now, talking about government pensions. 20 years ago, it was $2 billion a year.
Yes.
That figure is now $40 billion a year.
Yes.
And as you say, if you were to pencil out the obligations that will have to be faced over the next 20 years, you're talking about billions and billions and billions of dollars.
Yes.
And that has to come out of the revenue.
Yes, and as you pointed out, you have a smaller relative working population in relation to the older population now.
Yes.
So how are we going to account for that? The other thing to consider also is that for the past 2 years, we have had de-learning with children because of people being out of school.
Yes.
So the labor force going in now is not as productive
It's
as
handicapped.
we had before.
Yes.
And you know that the biggest challenge we've had as a country is that we've had declining labor productivity since 1972, apart from a few years in the 80s. So then it's a mammoth problem that we're not looking at, because when you look at the fiscal accounts, it doesn't show. It is something that is invisible. I mean, accountants will understand it, but it is invisible to everyone.
But you raise a very important point, Dennis, and it is this, that if the working population is going to have to shoulder the responsibility of sustaining an increasing elderly population, then it means that that working population has to be better skilled, has to be better prepared to embrace technology and innovation.
Yes.
If we're talking about a program of economic growth, it means that that smaller cohort of young people have to be sharp, they have to be on top of the game. What is coming out of the schools can be what has been coming out of the schools for a long time, where the majority of them just get something called a school leaving certificate. I don't know what that is supposed to mean.
Yeah, agree. And this is why I keep lamenting that the biggest improvement that we could have got out of the 2013 IMF agreement, we have not yet put it in place, which is labor market reform. In 2013, when the IMF put their agreement down, they said that labor market reform was critical to sustainable growth. We have not addressed that yet.
We discussed that on the program some time ago, and I got a sense. Well, it depends on the perspective you're dealing with, because certainly talking to people like Helen Davis White, she said some achievements had been made, but there were still some things that had not been tackled. What is outstanding?
Well, the reform of, for example, like, people don't like to talk about industrial disputes tribunal. There are no rules governing it. Gavin Goff will tell you, so you can catch someone stealing on camera and you can't do anything about it. Those things affect productivity. And, a few years ago, I think it was the IDB that did a study that showed that because of the way labor market is in the region, it's not just Jamaica, that there's this bias towards labor, right, which disrupts productivity. What you find is that there is a lot of contract labor coming on the scene. Now, what that has done, because we have a lot of short-term contracts being offered, is that people are left without pensions and health insurance. And that, again, comes around to what you talk about, the aging population. Because if you have an aging population that has not had health insurance and has not had pension, we're talking about maybe 10 to 20% of the labor market that has pension, then you have a serious problem on your hands. And it's not that they've had consistent employment. They've had short-term contracts because of the way the labor market has been. And those are the things we need to reform, because we are going to have a serious problem. And, 10 years from now, I don't know how we're going to pay for it.
Well. Let's look at that. Two issues that jump out at me from what you're saying. One is question of health insurance.
Yes.
Can Jamaica, given all that it's going through, and given all the obligations that workers and the population, given the high number of people who are either unemployed or hustling in the informal sector, so you don't even know who they are, could a viable health insurance scheme be introduced? That is one, which would enable people when they get old to at least cope somewhat better with their health care needs. That's one. And secondly, they need not only health care, but they need to eat 3 meals a day.
Yes.
Now, national insurance was introduced in 1966, the late Lyndon Newland. But we still, the last time I checked, it was something like 300,000 people contributing. There's still a lot of people who are outside of that. How do we get to a stage where we have some kind of universal coverage? National insurance provides something like $1,700 a week to pensioners, which can hardly buy food, but at least it's better than nothing. Is it possible for us to get to a stage where the Scandinavian countries, for example, impose 45% personal income tax, but they cover your health, education, right up to university level, social security, pension, the works? Think about that, and when I come back from the break, you help me with it. Jamaica Live, we're on Bridge 99. We're talking about aging population, what it means. And we're talking with economic analyst Dennis Chung. Dennis, I posed 2 issues to you when we took the break. I want to provoke your mind just a little more so you can give me a fulsome response. And I know that your mind can take a whole heap of provocation. Tell me now, the biggest wage-related contribution stroke deduction is the National Housing Trust.
Yes.
And it has accumulated. For the employers, it is really a tax. For the employee, it is an involuntary low-interest loan. Now, it has accumulated a whole heap of money. Built some houses, yes, but it accumulated so much money that, as you know, successive governments have raided it to meet its fiscal challenges, no?
Yes.
Let us sort of square bracket all of that. A big problem with the trust is that the majority, last time I looked at the numbers, the majority of the people, either who are contributing through this involuntary loan to the trust, or on whose behalf employers have to be paying this tax, the majority of them can't afford to qualify. They don't have the earnings to qualify for any housing benefit from the trust. And that really raises questions about the legitimacy of the thing. And I know there have been discussions about that, and I've actually seen the report that was commissioned when Nigel Clark was chairman there. But would I be crazy if I were to say that if I were a policymaker, I would give consideration? I don't say I would decide, but I would certainly give consideration to whether those salary wage-related deductions ought not to be redirected to support a national health insurance scheme and to support better retirement benefits for workers. The problem that would leave me with, and help me with this, is that we would still be confining ourselves to those persons in the formal economy who are contributing or who can be reached in order. if we want it for the thing to be universal, then you have to move away from just the wage-related thing, and you have to find a way whether you tack it on to GCT or whatever it is. But ought we to be thinking at this stage about finding a way to finance, given the changing dynamics of our demographic situation? Ought we to be trying to find a way to finance better provisions for elderly people so that they can at least eat some nutritious meals when they get old, that they can get the medication that they need and that they are increasingly going to need, because the older you get, the more susceptible you are to ailments, that you can perhaps engage somebody to come cook for you if you don't have no relatives around. Is this something that we ought to be looking at?
Yeah, it's not a bad thought. I mean, definitely, I think that, let me start with NHE. The NHE definitely needs to repurpose. The way it is going about its business now, I mean, might have served 20 or 30 years ago or 40 years ago. But certainly what I would look at for the NHE, because I see retirement as more than just health and being able to eat. Is also a place to live. Shelter is important. And certainly what I would be doing with the NHD so that the masses can benefit and Jamaica can benefit from a productive point of view, including the reduction of crime, is I would be using the NHT to redevelop and put infrastructure into the inner city communities and informal settlements. So you're using NHT to do that, because that, I think, is a great inhibitor when it comes to productivity, to have this sort of infrastructure in place. Some of the funds could be used to actually go into what you say, and I would channel it through the NHF. I think the NHF is a good organization, but it also needs to change its focus. And I think the NHF needs to work more. A few years ago, the same question was asked of me about a universal healthcare system. And I said it's quite possible. But let's not reinvent the wheel. Let's use the private health insurance companies and use their platform. So that way, what we could do also is get the benefit to those who need it most. So if you were to contract with a private healthcare company through NHF or multiple and say, listen, we as a government, we are going to contract with you and buy health insurance from you. So they take some of the risk from that point of view. Then you as a government could distribute those cards evenly. So everyone that goes to the hospital, whether they're a man who's earning $2 million a month or somebody that earning $100,000 a month, will be faced with a bill to do the same procedure for $100,000. But the person who's earning $100,000 a month, the government will issue them with a card that will remove that cost of the $100,000. The $2 million man goes there and he pays what he can pay, or if he has insurance, he pays the difference. I think that is the way to level the playing field and use the infrastructure that is there to do it. And of course, the actuaries would have to look at what it would cost, but I think it would be much less, because people who could pay, who can afford to pay, would pay, and the person who needs it can actually get the support. So I think that is how that needs to be addressed, right? And I don't know that you'll need to use using all of the NHT money for that if you were to use the insurance infrastructure that exists. Similarly, I think government needs to contract with the private companies also for the pension management, right? Because they have a huge bill coming up. I don't know how they're going to address it, to be honest with you, because even if they were to start from now, it's going to be very, very difficult. So one of the things I would be doing is trying to improve productivity as much as possible, right, to take off some of that. Because we're at a point now where a lot of these things government will not be able to fund.
Well,
right?
When you're talking about productivity, and I know, I've tracked it over the years myself.
Yeah.
But to try to link that with the subject that we've been discussing, which is the aging of the population. To what extent, from your knowledge and experience in the private sector, to what extent are people staying on the job because of the aging of the population, people staying on the job longer, so that room for young people who perhaps could be more productive because they're perhaps more amenable to new technology and so on. To what extent is the aging population shutting them out of the working labor force?
Well, a lot of people are staying on the job longer. A lot of people are not able to retire. I mean, and that's even more concerning. So how can we? And they do have the experience and the skills that we need. And I don't think that they necessarily have to displace the younger population. What we need to do as a country is improve our productive base so that you have more and more opportunities for people, right? That includes maybe getting employment for people overseas also, right? And a part of the problem, and you will also recognize this, Mr. Golding, is that one of the big challenges that the younger generation faces is that for the past few years, a lot of people have been leaving high school without even one subject, right? 70% of your high school cohort has been leaving without a subject, which means that productivity is challenged. Now, the way to address that, I mean, you're not, even some of the people who over the past 2 years have been out of school, they've been past the prime in terms of their gaining knowledge, right? We need to go to a place like heart. We need to reposition heart, and we need to use heart strategically to address the labor productivity issue we have. It is not a matter of just saying we're going to produce people who can do hair or barbers. No, what do we want for economic growth to happen? So a place like Hart should be sitting with like the PIOJ and saying, if I want to grow my economy, what do I need? Right? Sitting with the linkages committee at tourism and saying, what do you want? Right? We did some work when I was at PSOJ with the tourism industry, and the tourism industry at the time was saying, listen, many of our managers in a certain field, we have to carry them from overseas because we're not producing them here. So why wouldn't a Heart be sitting with those industries, the tourism, the bauxite, the construction, which we're carrying a lot of people for, and saying, what do you need? Where do you see that your development is going to happen over the next 5 to 10 years to the government? And then say, what do you need? We are going to now start putting our resources to train people there, right, and get them on board for the growth of the economy. That's how we have to address it. Because
to what extent, Dennis, and it may be a difficult question I'm asking you, but I'm asking you for a reason. I remember a couple of employers have said to me, I can't quantify them, but a couple of employers have said to me, look, we don't necessarily need trained workers, we need trainable workers. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Because when they come out of some vocational center, the Heart or whatever, we find that the training that they have got there may be good for some other enterprise, but it's not what we want. Our difficulty, they have said to me, is that when we take somebody here, if they weren't able to pass maths and English, it is extremely difficult for us to train them. We're willing to train them, but if they don't have those basics. I remember saying some years ago, those kids that, for whatever reason, whether it is their own indolence or the lack of parental support, they're not really making the grade in school. Why don't we say to them, all right, well, forget about the history and forget about the science. We want you to just pass 2 subjects, maths and English. And later on, if you're so minded, you can go catch up on the others. But we don't want you to leave school unless you have maths and English. And some people in the education sector wanted to burn me at the stake because they thought I was crazy.
No, and I agree with you. That is the strategic approach and vision that a place like Hart needs to take. Hart should not be isolated from the private sector. Hart should not be isolated from the school system. They should be supporting them and saying to them, what do you want? Where they should be looking at the school system and say, where is the shortfall happening?
Is the Ministry of Education, Dennis, is the Ministry of Education, for example, in dialogue with the private sector to say, no, give us some guidance in terms of what kind of training you need us to give these young kids before they turn up to you for employment? Is that kind of conversation taking place?
I am not aware of that, and that is what should be happening. Look at a place also like Students' Loan. I've been saying for years, Mr. Golding, that if someone wants to come and borrow money to study the DNA of a raindrop, and we have no need for that skill, we should not be putting our resources there.
I agree with you entirely.
We should be putting our money to lend people or even grant scholarships in the places that government needs to drive.
I agree with you entirely. When I said that some years ago, the Guild of Students wrote to shut down the campus because I was in office at the time. And they thought I was crazy. Then I'm out of time, but the discussion has been very helpful. Let's continue this, perhaps not necessarily on the aging aspect, but there are several things about Jamaica's challenges that I want to explore your mind on. So I hope I can have you back on the program.
Yes, man, no problem. No problem. Thanks a lot.
Thank you for joining me, Dennis.
Right,
That brings us to the end of the program. We're wrapping up now. I'll be back here next week, Monday, to do it all over again. Different topic, different set of guests. Thanks to my producer, thanks to my studio engineer, thanks to all the whole crew down here at Bridge 99. Thank you so very much. See you next week, Monday.